Right. Thank you very, very much. And big thank you to the GenZero Climate Summit team for hosting us today. Thank you for everyone for making the time. Conscious it's quite a bit of time from the afternoon, so thank you for listening to us. For what we hope would be quite an engaging discussion. A number of panels today have already picked up the point around unlocking finance, and particularly using the use of carbon credits to unlock finance for carbon mitigation, carbon removal, as well as low carbon projects. And I think the topic is particularly topical given the announcement yesterday of the ARC Coalition initiative to aggregate demand for high integrity carbon credits to help unlock financing for climate mitigation projects. But before we go into, I guess, some of the detail around how we finance and how we support and unlock financing, just to set a little bit of context, we've talked about bankability quite a bit today already. Just taking a step back, what do we mean when we talk about bankability in a sustainability context? I think, Ben, particularly from your perspective, straddling the sort of traditional project finance as well as sustainability, what does bankability in this context look like to you?
It's a good way to start. And let me start, actually, before I do that, by saying how nice it is to be on this stage. There's greenery, there's some birds. I don't think I've ever been on such a nice stage. So it's really nice to be here, and congratulations to GenZero and everyone that's organised this fantastic event. Well done. Sustainability, if I was to survey everyone in this room and ask them what do they think when I talk about sustainability, there'd be lots of different answers. And I think it's helpful to begin the discussion by anchoring ourselves in what do we mean by sustainability in a corporate context. One of my challenges in my current role is that I deal with a large institution. We have approximately 85,000 people in over 50 markets. And so I've really focused on keeping sustainability simple. And when I talk to people about sustainability internally and externally, I start with sustainability in a corporate context, simply meaning achieving profitability and having a positive or non-negative impact on the environment and society. And I think if we can view sustainability through that lens, it actually makes a lot of sense. The simpler things become, the easier they are to consume, the easier it is for them to be repeated, commoditized, and used broadly. And to me, that's what sustainability is about. It's about sharing the message, finding ways to allow people to embrace sustainability so that it can benefit everyone. So if you think about sustainability through that lens and then translate that into project bankability, well, what are we talking about with project bankability? In fact, it's not very different. It is about achieving profitability, managing risk in order to repay debt over a long period of time in connection with an asset. So in that sense, sustainability and project bankability are very well aligned.
Yeah, and I think we've been, and that's quite a helpful context to put it to situate the discussion, because when we talk about financing and profitability, it is with a view to ensuring that we do reflect the value of carbon reduction in investor returns, as it well should, and in order to incentivize investment at scale, because obviously this is important, but there has to still be a economic rationale for it. There are various financing options with respect to carbon credit projects, Chris. So we see, for example, non-recourse project financing, something that I'm, from my world and deeply familiar with, which basically means you finance a project solely on the basis of that project's cash flow and limited recourse to that. We also see things like prepayment structures, other types of structures. What do you see, Chris, in terms of the sort of pros, cons? Why would one go one route rather than the other?
Well, thanks, Lilia, and thanks to GenZero for inviting me to participate in this panel. I think building on the experience that I've had over the last 20 years, seeing different types of carbon project be brought to market, I think you can see the evolution of financing techniques being used. Most of the financing that we still see is very much in the form of prepayments. And we are seeing the beginnings of project financing, which is quite exciting. But I think the key point is that, as Ben said, this is about delivering simplicity, and I think there's a lot that we can do within the carbon market, within the community ourselves, to make that financing process a much smoother one. Maybe a different focus from some of the other conversations about what others need to do to make this market work more effectively. I think there is things in this area that we could look at and we should explore on this panel where it's within our own gift to make the market work more effectively.
Yeah, and I think that's that's an interesting point, Chris. And we were talking about it before in terms of the blockers around the use of carbon credits as a revenue stream to support financing. And if you look at, and something very, very basic, you know, for any financier looking to lend to a project, is you want to ensure that you have a robust security package, particularly with respect to the cash flows. And in this context, that would be the carbon credits. Yet one of the issues that we've had is just how challenging it is to take security over carbon credits. Can you comment about that, and what do you think what more needs to happen to help facilitate something which actually, in a way, if you sort of think about it, is quite simple and quite basic to supporting financing?
Yeah, no, sure. I think the key point here is the opportunity to kind of get project finance in particular is often dependent on the quality of the offtake. And I think, Ben, hopefully you can talk a bit more of your experience around that. But just taking it back at a level, why it is a useful technique to try and establish or non-recourse or limited recourse financing. Those projects that achieve that kind of lending often are some of the best structured. They have to be. Is an advantage to the project developer in that they protect the rest of their assets from claims brought by the financier or the lender or the off-taker. And actually, from an off-taker's perspective, it's not necessarily a bad thing. You don't always, many of my clients looking at projects and looking to off-take carbon credits, they're not looking to kind of have recourse to the developer's entire balance sheet. They're not looking to want to kind of have the opportunity to force against projects they're not actually financing. What they want is something which is self-contained and well packaged. I think that is probably the kind of the key point, which is that if there is good planning at the outset of these projects to set them up in the right way, facilitates that financing when it comes along later. And too often we see projects that have been developed without a clear strategy as to how that financing is going to come in later.
Yeah, and what are some of the, so if we look at the kind of, I guess, the structuring of these projects, so what has been, I think, what's been some of the tension around the structuring? I mean, obviously in a kind of ideal situation, we have everything housed in individual, in this project finance kind of context, you have projects sit in individual SPVs. It does make the financing a lot easier. But for what potentially should people start planning in advance or thinking in advance of?
Yeah, I think that's that is the thing, isn't it? I mean, we often see an SPV structure as the starting point. It isn't always the case that the SPV is there from day one. We do see developers, not just in the carbon space, but in renewables more generally, they'll put in place some of the early stage project development, the early stage contracts. They may well be in a development vehicle which is generic to a number of different projects they're developing, but they do so with a plan to be able to push those contracts, those rights that are needed for the project into a special purpose vehicle that then can raise the capital needed to take the project forward and develop it into a kind of revenue stream in due course. Mm-hmm.
And Ben, so in terms of your perspective of the projects that come across on your desk, I mean, what have been, I guess, some of the blockers that, sort of basically make banking some of these projects challenging?
Just picking up on a point Chris made a moment ago, and that is project finance is a good vehicle for this type of development because it really pressures people to focus their thinking around every aspect of what it is we're trying to achieve. And project finance typically requires the involvement of a huge number of people, from environmental engineers through to insurers, through to lawyers and accountants and project developers and governments. And so in that sense, it's very complex. That complexity is one of the key issues associated with developing carbon projects, particularly where models are nascent and developing over time, because people may not have a roadmap in terms of how they wish to develop this particular project. If you contrast that to Project Finance 101, let me take a simple example of social infrastructure PPPs in Australia. There is a very well understood model for executing those types of transactions. They have a special purpose vehicle. There is availability-based payments, and there is a risk allocation. Now, that is all subject to minor adjustment and tweaking, but broadly, counterparties know that entering into a social infrastructure PPP in Australia, that's what they can expect to see. And that then frees them up to think about all of the other complex issues that they need to deal with, the contractual relationships, the risk allocation, how they might negotiate force majeure. Oh, we've heard LIBOR's going away. How do we deal with that in the contracts? All sorts of other technical nuances, which actually should be the focus, because when it comes to project financing, carbon financing, is very complicated. The types of projects that are being developed and built often involve governments, involve numerous financing parties, can run into the billions of dollars. We're even seeing now data centers running into the 35 billion US dollar range. These are enormously complex undertakings with huge sums of money. There is a big lead time where construction takes place, and there's really no revenue generation. And as a consequence, there needs to be good structuring and trust. Where I think we're seeing the green shoots in the carbon space is where we have motivated counterparties coming together to execute on the basis of some core foundational principles. And Chris alluded earlier to offtake being one of those. That is absolutely fundamental to some of these early stage projects. And we've seen this recently in the United States in connection with a transaction there with Kimmeridge, that was Chestnut Carbon. Effectively, that project was an afforestation-reforestation project where tracts of land were purchased across multiple US states. Trees were planted effectively to generate carbon credits, and then they were purchased, or will be purchased, pursuant to a long-term offtake agreement with Microsoft. So what are the key elements? The key elements are you have a model that you want to execute on. You're going to use a project finance type structure. You have a long-term offtake agreement. You have a high-quality offtaker that's highly rated. And then you think about the other important building blocks, which are taking as much security as possible. And typically in project financing, you take virtually everything that you can. That is both a benefit, but also a defensive mechanism, so that if necessary, you can package up the project and protect it from outside forces. These elements are absolutely key. And of course, we talked today, and the other panels talked extensively about the core issues that we need to think about in the context of carbon. So they are issues like quality, like regulation, like pricing, and consistency in all of those areas is fundamental. But they are almost potentially could be viewed as nuances associated with carbon that we need to account for as we build out the broader project structure. I think it was Rachel on the first panel made a very good point about allowing ourselves a bit of room to fail, a bit of room to create and develop structures. And I agree. I think this is actually a really good point because we don't have all the answers today. We need to do a bit of trial and error type work to find the right way forward. And when we can find a model like we've done for Chestnut in the US, what it does is it gives people a template. And they can then look at, well, how can I use that template in different parts of the world. And the good thing about the environment and about carbon and about project development is it's universal. Many of the principles are universal. Now, there are different challenges in certain regions. For example, in ASEAN, we may have challenges around land rights and community rights. But what we do know is that it is a highly focused sector where you've got a lot of specialists, a lot of people like the people in this room who know a lot of the detail. The secret sauce is bringing that all together and then making it simple for people to understand and use. And if you can produce those template models, advertise those, and push them out into the market, I think it makes it simple for people to execute on the basis of those. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you become, the more confidence you get, and the more commoditized it becomes. So it grows.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, because I think one of the things that's a little bit daunting, I suppose, when people talk about project finance is people think about the large-scale infrastructure. They think about, you look at offshore wind, or you look at big refinery projects, and they think it's all too complicated. We shouldn't be using any of this because actually it's just unnecessary complication. But actually taking it back to the heart of what we're trying to do, it is, and I think earlier speakers alluded to, is about how you manage risk. That's fundamental to project finance, which is ultimately how we look to manage some of that risk. And I guess, Chris, in some of the transactions, because obviously you're having to navigate that as we go, and trying to how has that played out in terms of how people look at structuring projects? Because obviously it's applying, whilst quite a well-trodden path, it is applying it to a new sector. So what has been some of those challenges in terms of how you navigate that?
Yeah, I think great question. I think the challenge that we often come up against is a question of understanding and acceptance in the first place. Perhaps I'm going to touch on two challenges. First being that, and the need to get people comfortable with the idea that the security package that often underpins this finance isn't about trying to take away someone's asset, isn't about having a position which they're looking to aggressively enforce, and nor is often the case do they want kind of security beyond the project which actually they're looking to finance. Typically, what gets in the way of doing that is where either the project registration or certain of the kind of contractual rights that have been put in place at an early stage in the project are actually sitting in different legal entities. So there may be a kind of a first step taken towards doing a project-based financing, but actually you then find only half the assets you need for the project are actually in that entity, and the preparation hasn't been taken to actually ensure that it's easy to move contracts in that have already been put in place into that entity. For example, by having something in those contracts, perhaps with communities or with in relation to land rights, which allow for their easy transferability into a special purpose vehicle when the project comes to be financed. So I think acceptance is one thing, and understanding of kind of what flexibilities are needed and ultimately what the end state needs to look like and why that is important and simplifies things, because you definitely don't want to have to take out two lots of security package, and that increases costs, increased friction in the transaction structure. I think the second one, which is a continuing frustration, which actually is largely within the gift of this market, is the questions around how the registries and the standard bodies are actually accommodating or not the idea of security and financing. I think we're still in this kind of position where there's a sort of resistance to taking steps to recognize security interests, to facilitate the practical enforcement of that security interest through the registries, through the standards, which is a fear of that somehow kind of coming back as a liability for those organizations, and recognizing often their not-for-profit, I can understand that reticence to be in a risk position. I think the reality is that they're, getting those things right, working on trying to kind of build those structures to be more effective, more responsive to financing structures, would de-risk, in many respects, the position of those bodies. But it is something that we spend time on when we're looking at these projects. It costs our clients more money to do that. We have to find workarounds. We have to ask people, for example, in relation to programs where there's multiple projects being developed or extensions to existing projects which have different financiers coming into them, to look at how they can split those projects, all of which is deeply frustrating for everybody involved, because it isn't necessary, and it's a feature of the design of the standards and the registries that hasn't taken into account where we need to be now, which is to draw in this capital to kind of develop projects and to take out some of the friction, and that would be a very easy, in my view, thing to think about.
Yeah.
Chris has made a very important point there around diligence, and just maybe unpack that a little bit. The more money and time that counterparties have to spend conducting their own due diligence to think about novel structures, the more it disincentivizes them from wanting to do this type of work, because it costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and then the cost-benefit equation doesn't work. So this is again where defaulting back to these template models or approaches can be beneficial, because you have to spend less time thinking about issues that have already been solved. Now, there's lots of different ways that people in this room and within our ecosystem can contribute to that. When I first arrived, for instance, to Singapore almost 11 years ago, Alan and Gledhill, who are here today, had a wonderful initiative around standardizing some of the project finance documentation. And that opens up knowledge and understanding to people across the region who perhaps don't understand that level of nuance. So if everybody in the ecosystem made a contribution of that nature in these new and evolving areas, all of a sudden the pieces of the puzzle start to fit together, and we develop a bit of a run rate, and then templates start to fall into place, making it easy to execute transactions. And so I think this is why events like today are very important, and then sort of thought leadership initiatives are also very important. And of course, it's not just the private sector. We have the multilaterals in the region, the Asian development banks, World Bank, MEGA, and so on, who can contribute to this thinking, and it's very important. Clifford Capital is another one here in Singapore that does a lot of thinking in this space. So I think collectively, it's just about not reinventing the wheel, but finding how we can optimize it for new endeavors, like what we're trying to think about and do here.
Yeah. Okay, and actually, we've got one quite interesting question, which I think links to some of what we've been talking about. So there's a question here around tips for early stage developers in terms of structuring. So the top 2 or 3 things you think they should leave this room as being important that they should factor early on. And I think bearing in mind, especially, I think we've got a number of people who in this space who are startups, who may not be as familiar with these types of financing concepts. What's worth bearing in mind from the outset?
Maybe just a couple of things then. I think this is all about timing here, and not trying to, because it may sound like I am trying to do this, over-engineer things from day one, and have lots of kind of complicated corporate structures set up, ready to go for the moment you have an idea about a project, never mind a conversation with someone about it. I think the point is that when you start to put in place those building blocks which are of a kind of legal, contractual nature, when you're looking at how your plan for kind of which standards you're going to use, how you're going to utilize those standards, how is the project going to get and generate its carbon credits, that you start to kind of do so in a way which says, well, ultimately, when I need to, or if bring in third-party financing, or I want to de-risk my participation in this particular project because I'm going to sell equity to someone else, to give myself flexibility to recycle capital, I'll need to have something which allows me to look at it as a single unit. So your contract should have a novation clause or an assignment clause or a transfer clause that's workable and effective. That you should be thinking about step-in rights for certain contracts, that give a bank or a financier the ability to cure breaches in the event that there is a problem with the project down the line, that when the investors come in, when bank comes in and looks at the project, he can see that the tools that are there to help support his investment committee process are already in place. And that those early stage actions, which cost effectively, well, they cost nothing. They're just, a few short clauses in those contracts can make a huge difference down the line. And getting all of your key project building blocks in the same legal entity, or being able to do so at the right point when you want to bring in finance, again, is about good planning, not about spending money. It's about saving money. Hear that from the lawyers.
Ben, from your perspective?
Yeah, completely agree with Chris's views there. I think, let's go back to what I said at the start of this session. Sustainability in a corporate context is about achieving profitability and having a positive or non-negative impact on the environment and society. Where's the money coming from? How are you going to make money out of this project? Does it make money? That has to be a fundamental question that everyone is asking. And we shouldn't shy away from that, because an organization itself would not be sustainable without achieving profitability. It simply wouldn't exist. So we must accept that as an economic reality. I think the next point I would make, and this is again just to add to something Chris has already mentioned, but it is about surrounding yourselves with advisors who you can trust, who are creative, who are innovative, who can think through different structures, but have that grounded in core principles. So what is a project finance model and how does it work? And how can we leverage that for what we're trying to achieve here? That's a quick route to market. So I think it's surrounding yourself. And then it's thinking about, well, who are the broader counterparties that we're trying to deal with in this structure? Does it make sense? Does it all add up? And a lot of the challenges I get from people is, well, why would anyone be interested in voluntary carbon these days? I think people are overlooking the fact that something as simple as a Microsoft has made climate commitments. And if as an organization like Microsoft makes climate commitments, it faces legal and reputational risk if it doesn't discharge those. There's broadly three types of risk. There's the risk that it does harm or is perceived to do harm. There's the risk that it's perceived to be not doing enough. There's the risk that it doesn't do what it says it will do. And all of these areas carry legal and reputational and potentially compliance regulatory risk. And increasingly so. We know that the MAS in Singapore, we know that the UK FCA were very focused a number of years ago around advertising. The Advertising Standards Authority in the UK was some of the first to issue judgments around what people could or could not say at bus stops when they're advertising green products and services. We know that the MAS is focused on anti-greenwashing and making sure that consumers are getting what they paid for and understanding. And again, just going back to this point about simplicity, we need to be in a position to communicate these ideas simply to people so that we're not seen to be overcomplicating something that they're meant to understand so that they can embrace it. So these are kind of a couple of things from my perspective.
Yeah, no, and that's helpful because actually that leads nicely to the other question that we have. We've talked about market, so it's come up, I think it was theme yesterday, as a theme today, around demand for carbon credits. And we talked about earlier in some of the earlier panels around the concept of a bankable carbon credit in and of itself and the need for various regulatory changes. But the question here is an interesting one. So in the absence of these broader market changes, so leaving aside that a number of things have to happen in the market, how can project developers, I guess, self-help themselves? So the question is self-help themselves into a project finance type structure. So I think picking up on your point, Ben, in terms of, showing credible offtake, for instance. So what can project developers do in the working in a scenario where just the market itself is still under change?
Well, I think it's about going back to first principles and asking what it is they're trying to achieve and why they're trying to do it. You've got to start there. The idea of something sounding like it might be useful is fine, but what is the purpose of actually doing it? Is there going to be a value add? Is there a reputational driver? Is there a regulatory driver? Is there some sort of benefit you're aiming for into the future? I think these are questions people are going to start asking more and more as we see the stresses that we're currently seeing in the world around energy, and in particular around energy security, and what types of project choices people will make. In the short term, one would anticipate that the energy squeeze is going to result in higher prices, is going to result in supply chain stresses. So that would mean that some of the projects people are looking at or considering developing cost more money. So then the next question becomes, well, could I optimize my revenue stream or improve my revenue stream by the use of carbon? I think it's one of the sort of things that people might be thinking about. And the other is, well, what types of incentives might be available? Over and above the kind of regulatory regimes, what type of incentives might be available? And those incentives may not necessarily be financial incentives. They may be reputational incentives. They may be stakeholder-related incentives. People are interested in companies that are doing this type of work. So I think, look, again, I mean, not to labour the point, but it's got to come down to basic financing principles. Projects don't fail because they get to the financing stage and people decide they're not going to provide financing. In fact, there's a huge amount of money floating around looking for a home. There is an enormous amount of natural capital in this part of the world. I think in Indonesia alone, there's something like, I don't know, 100 million hectares of forest, which is equivalent to something like 10 billion tons of carbon. So huge amounts of capital. So the building blocks are there. It is about how do we take those pieces, put them together into a puzzle to make it palatable for someone. And I think start with those first principles and go from there. Don't treat it any way differently simply because it's carbon. Treat it in the same way and try to accommodate the nuance would be my approach.
Yeah. I think it's a good question. The reason I'm going to pick on one bit of the question. I hope the question asker doesn't mind me doing this, but we do focus a lot on market changes and what might need to happen to kind of allow the market to progress outside of things that are within the control of the carbon market itself. And I think that sometimes distracts us from seeing what's already there and the opportunities that are already available to us. So I would say there isn't a need to kind of necessarily, for the purposes of the kind of financing that we're talking about, to fix all of the kind of questions around what a carbon credit is in legal terms, how do you take security over the credit itself. Here it's enough to say, you know, most financiers will look at it and say, look, what are the key contractual legal rights that constitute this project? What kind of recourse do I have in relation to those contracts? They're all very recognizable things, from a carbon project to a wind farm to a solar farm to a data center now, which is the kind of big surge in project finance opportunities. They are things that we all recognize. We don't need to solve lots of problems with the nature of carbon credits to be able to access those finance structures. So I think it's about kind of thinking about bringing forward great projects which are structured in a very conventional way, and not worrying necessarily about whether ultimately the security package that's put in place over the equity will work, or over the project itself. These are kind of quite academic questions about carbon credits, and they don't necessarily play into the day-to-day of financing these projects. I think they're eminently financeable, eminently investable without solving those problems, as long as they're structured in the right way.
And I think that's a really, really good takeaway just in terms of the fact that the potential that's already there and what we can already be doing, even whilst we navigate the broader sort of market context. And I think, Ben, you picked up, and just in the last 5 minutes that we have, Ben, you mentioned about, obviously we are in there's plenty going on in the world at the moment in terms of the current geopolitical situation, especially in the Middle East. Now, what impact do we see that having in terms of how people look at sustainability, how people look at low carbon projects or these types of projects?
It's fascinating to me that the oil crunch as a consequence of the blockade in the Strait of Hormuz is turning people's attention to energy security. And they're looking for models where countries have prioritized energy security, and an obvious example is China. We know that they have prioritized energy security simply because they don't wish to be reliant on the import of fossil fuels. That has not only promoted the development of their renewables technology and their renewables dependence, it has bled into other parts of their technology and innovation. You walk around the streets of Singapore now, and there are so many Chinese vehicles, electric vehicles, and they are amazing cars when you sit in them. So this consequence, this change that we're seeing, and I'd lived in the Middle East for 10 years, and it's a terrible situation, and I certainly hope it's resolved very soon. But I guess the silver lining of all of this is that people are actually seriously asking themselves about energy security, how they can make themselves or put themselves into a stronger position moving forward. And the benefit for ASEAN is they have the opportunity to leapfrog old technologies, to think about how to embrace new low-cost technologies like battery energy storage, solar panels, and use those to provide and enhance their diversification towards an energy mix for the future. I think it's a very exciting time as a consequence. And when I think about the G20 several months ago, and 19 out of the 20 nations reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Agreement, I haven't lost hope. I don't believe that countries are disinterested in sustainability simply because there are some loud voices in the room. I think technology is progressive and we need to look forward and not be regressive. So it's about embracing the future, cost effectiveness, and the energy security question will play into that very seriously in people's minds. So for me, that's really exciting and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, I guess that I think energy security of the different kind of priorities from an energy policy perspective has always trumped anything else. As soon as people start to worry about that, then it's a huge driver of action. I think we should look at what's happening in the context of a time of change within the energy sector. I mean, I think if you go back 15, 20 years, you would have seen relatively little change. It was a relatively unexciting sector to be involved in because we would, develop more gas fields, we would find more oil reserves, and that's the kind of playbook which we repeat over and over again. Whatever else is coming, one thing is certain, and that is that we will continue to develop more renewables, to develop alternative forms of energy generation. The drivers that are coming from AI and data centers are just going to accelerate that process. And once you have that diversity, and I don't think it was ever a question of, and going to the theme of yesterday, binaries, it was never a question of, in my mind, well, we can't have oil and gas, that's never part of the mix. You have to be a renewables and a kind of clean energy person, or you're a conventional energy person. I think it's always been about the mix. I think the mix is becoming more diverse. It will shift towards low carbon for many, many reasons, energy security being one of them. And if you're a country without access to either the economic power or the physical access to those hydrocarbon resources, and renewables and non-hydrocarbon is the way in which you get energy security. So I think it's interesting and dynamic time. It is a terrible situation in the Middle East, and mustn't forget that. But as a driver of change, it will bring change.
Yeah, and that's, I think, and on that note, I think in terms of what this means for how we look at sustainability, how we look at low carbon solutions as part of, to the extent that we still have to have carbon emitting technologies used, I think that's all quite significant, and actually quite in a way taking a positive out of that, and more generally in terms of the I guess the fact that there is still so much that we can do, in terms of how we structure projects and how we look to finance projects outside of the stuff that perhaps are less within control. I think hopefully that resonates with people in terms of the things that we can still do and incentivize that growth in a sector which is so badly needed as part of our climate crisis. So thank you very much, Ben and Chris,
Thank you.
and thank you everyone for listening.